Hi there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Cloud-Based Mayhem. Okay, first some housekeeping. I asked for people to put up reviews or share stuff in return for being on the list to win one of these really cool paraglider needs a ride to car signs that Josh Eater, a friend of mine down in Utah, puts out. Super lightweight, great little things you can just throw in a tiny little bag that they come with and keep them in your kit. And so I've got those winners. I'll be reaching out to those, but one of them I wanted to read by Andy Reid. And this is just kind of cool. He put up a review on iTunes and Stitcher that says, "Stop, look no further. It doesn't matter if you're an experienced pilot with hundreds of hours under your belt or a complete rookie. These podcasts provide something for everyone." Gavin McClure gets into all sorts of conversations with some of the world's most experienced pilots to gain access to their wealth of knowledge and wisdom and get out to the free-flying world. In a world overloaded with information of varying degrees of authenticity, you can choose to trawl through a mass of videos, podcasts, books, and documents, or you can come to the Cloud-Based Mayhem and get a mass of well-informed information distilled straight to you. From SIV to ground handling, from racing to ridge soaring, from meteorology to aerodynamics, from paragliding to hang gliding to sailplanes, it's all there. Save yourself with load of time, download the whole back catalog of podcasts. There's now, 64, 65? Get comfortable and settle in for some fascinating, funny, eye-opening, and awe-inspiring stories from free flight enthusiasts who cannot help themselves just tell us why they do what they do that we all love so much. So thank you, Gavin, and all those who contribute to make this such a fantastic resource. Keep up the great work. So thanks, Andy. I really appreciate that. Puts a smile on my face. And yes, thanks to all of our guests who make all this possible, and thanks to all of you who make all this possible. This show is kind of cool. We take a little diversion here. We've been doing that quite a bit lately. I was down in Valle de Bravo for the Monarca this January. There were a lot of reserve tosses. We've talked about them on some of the recent shows. All of them went really well, I think. I didn't hear of any that didn't go well. And one of them was by our editor, Myles Connolly. A couple weeks later, he sent me a long email about, kind of what in the aftermath of that, what he'd learned and what he should have done differently, and some stuff with the inReach and radios and retrieve and just safety and psychology of throwing the reserve, SIV, all the aspects that go into throwing a reserve. It's not just one simple thing. It's usually a cascade of things. Often a cascading event in your wing. But yeah, he learned a lot from it, and I learned a lot from it actually reading his email. So we thought it'd be really fun to do a show just dedicated to his reserve toss. So, it's something that comes around for most pilots somewhere in their career. For acro pilots, it's very common. They do it all the time, and it's not a big deal. So we want to make throwing the laundry not a big deal, and it shouldn't be. They do work, but many people are pretty nervous about it, and you really do have to have the right headspace, not only just the technique of getting it out at the right time and not throwing it into your wing and stuff, but just kind of having the right mental attitude about a reserve rather than pounding in. So this is a cool talk. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. It's one of those really important ones, and you're not going to learn how to fly a lot better from this, but part of flying a lot better is being safe, and this certainly goes to that. So without further delay, please enjoy this talk with our editor, Myles Connolly. Myles, dude, so cool to have you on the show, the dude behind the scenes that edits all these puppies and makes them sound so good. We were just down together a few weeks ago in Mexico at the Monarca, and you had a little episode right before I got there. Actually, right when I got there. It was right before the comp started. You were super stoked.
Yeah, it was like your first or second day. Yeah.
Yeah. It was you were super psyched to fly the comp. You'd just been down there for a week, and you were rallying and stoked. And had a little episode, and we've been getting all this feedback, as you know, because you get to hear all these from tons of the guests or tons of the listeners that they wish I would speak to more people that with lower hours, that are kind of going through that whole like intermediate thing, and that's kind of squarely where you are.
Yeah,
and,
for sure.
And so I thought I'm just so psyched you reached out and said, "Hey, man, I've had a few weeks to think about this." And I think we need to talk about reserves more and like the whole psychology and, basically like break it all down. Like what happened. So why don't we start off with just, you as a pilot before Monarca, how many hours, how many years, what you've been doing, what wing were you on? And then let's get into kind of what happened that day.
Yeah, cool. So first off, I'm just so happy to be doing this for a bunch of reasons, but it's a real pleasure just to be, and a bit surreal to be on this side of the mic and talking to you about it. So I'm a P3 pilot. I have 120 hours. I started flying in 2015 and took my P2 training through Eagle in Santa Barbara, did the whole paragliding boot camp in about 2 weeks' time. And it was epic. And it was everything that I dreamed it would be. And I literally, like when I called Rob and said, I want to take paragliding lessons and I want to order all the gear. He's like, well, maybe you want to try the lessons first and then see about the gear. I was like, no, man, I'm fully into this. Like I've been looking at it for 20 years. This is my thing. I'm doing it. And he's like, okay,
ready.
brother. Yeah. So it was great. So, 120 hours in 2.5 years and pretty wide ranging. I mean, I'm very lucky. I'm a documentary filmmaker and I get to travel the world, and paragliding is just this sort of magical escape that I can use when I need it on location. So in those years, I've flown in France, I've flown in Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, England. I've also flown here in the Owens Valley and up there with you in Sun Valley last summer. And, I've done some pretty good cross-country runs, nothing like what you guys do. But for me, 30, 40, 50 miles is a good run and feeling like I'm building my hours and my experience. So while I'm not an expert, I'm not a rookie either. And I've had some moments in the air and felt like I had it under control. I haven't done an SIV course yet, and we'll come back around to that. But it's something that was high on my list of priorities and is much higher on my list of priorities now.
So that day, I think a lot of people listening have flown Valle. It certainly has a reputation, but let's break it down a little bit before we get even close to what happened. Just for the folks who haven't flown Valle, explain to them, because this was your first trip to Valle.
Yeah,
right?
It was. I've been hearing about it since I started flying, and it was one of those places that I was kind of holding off on because it has a little bit of a rep for being spicy, But this little talk that we're going to do is really to kind of dig down into the reserve toss experience, because so many people that we have on the show, they're like, oh yeah, and then I tossed my reserve, or oh, I pulled it out accidentally, I came down under reserve, and they make it sound so casual. And yet when you're there and you're like reaching for the handle, it does not feel casual at all. And so in the weeks since I was down there and tossed the reserve, I've had a lot of chances to just think about it. And I feel really good. I'm glad I threw the reserve, but I'm also kind of, I feel a little sheepish. Like, why did I get into that situation? What did I do to put myself in a place where I needed to throw the reserve? Could I have done something better or more or less to have averted the reserve toss? And the answer is definitely yes. So, just the thoughts that have come to me in those weeks, I thought might help other people who are kind of at my level or a little bit less. And so let's talk about Valle. So Valle is world class. I mean, it is just the coolest place to fly for so many reasons. Mexico is amazing. Food is amazing. People amazing. Every single day, you're just up there in real air, real thermals flying. It's the first time I've ever thermaled up in a gaggle with over 100 pilots. And I'd seen all the videos, and I was just like, man, I hope I'm ready for this. And when I got into it, I was like so ready for it. And I was just loving it. And to be there with friends and people that had been instructors with me in Santa Barbara, it was just epic. Yeah, it was a really good thing. And that day was my 6th day flying. So I'd already set personal bests. I'd done a 5-hour flight, which was my longest flight to date. I'd done the longest out and back flight that I'd ever done before. And I was feeling, again, kind of that intermediate syndrome, like, hey man, I think I have this place pretty dialed. Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about it.
So you're feeling confident, like you weren't feeling sheepish on launch that day, or like, maybe this isn't a day for me. You were like, this is it. I'm getting after it.
No, and in fact, it was interesting because, El Peñón, which for those that don't know it is this big sort of giant rocky wall that just juts up out of the plane. it's a pretty gnarly place to fly. And especially in a crowd, you'll see people kind of coming into that phase and they'll just suddenly start rocketing up at 4, 5, 6 meters a second. And it's real, it's punchy and it's full on. And I remember going in there going, I'm ready for this. I've got it. And being like 50 feet away from the wall and just getting lifted and just being like, yeah, man, I'm loving this. Not knowing at all, like really how bad it could go, how fast it could go bad. And so I handled all that, and that was great. But it was also, that should have been an indication to me, like, hey, man, where are you on your scale, which we'll come back to in a little while. But yeah, so that particular day, I don't know why, but you and I buddied up with Flynn, and we took a taxi up to launch, and we were talking about the Theo de Blick episode because we had just finished that, and I think it had gone up on the podcast. And one of the things that I took away from that, because I will never be an acro guy, like that stuff just seems batshit crazy to me, but you learn something from every one of these podcasts. And Theo was saying, oh yeah, like anytime he balls up the glider, he has this protocol. He like knows the steps that he goes through before he tosses his reserve. And step number 1 is, where am I in terms of altitude? And then, he goes through this process and it's just automated. He doesn't even think about it. He just like goes through the process and it works. And so we were talking about that, and it was just fresh in my mind, as on the drive up. And then when we got up there, it's crowded, Valle on launch on a good day. There's 150 plus people all sort of jockeying for position. And this is before the comp. So it was just wide open with everybody kind of like, I remember watching 2 and 3 wings go off at the same time, like brushing wingtips off of launch and stuff like that, which, to me just seemed a little bit, aggressive. But at the same time, that's how you get everybody off in that window when it's launchable. So I got all my gear together, and like I say, I had been flying there for a few days already, so I was pretty comfortable with the setup. And I launched, and as I was going off towards the house thermal, I remember climbing up, and suddenly I saw somebody sort of spiral it into the trees. And I remember thinking, when they were still up above, like, just toss your reserve, and they didn't do that. And so right away, I'm kind of like, wow, what just happened there? Like, why didn't they throw their reserve? And they had plenty of time. They could have done that, and they didn't. And I found out later that that woman basically like balled it up into the trees and walked away without a single tear in her glider. And I was very jealous of that. But at the same time, I'm guessing that that was just very, very lucky. Yeah. So seeing that crash, again, it just made me hypersensitized.
Before we move on, I was just going to say, the Theo thing, the Theo de Blick, the other one that I always think of is Revis, in his talk on the podcast. He was really talking more about like just always having in mind your height and how much time are you going to give it. Okay, I'm at 500, I'm at 1,000, I'm at 10,000, all these different levels where you're just constantly conscious of, okay, if I totally lost the glider right now, how long would I have before I had to throw the reserve? Because you get kind of tied up in trying to deal, and you lose you lose your perspective, which is everything. That's what's so important. And what I really liked about Theo's wasn't just so much the process, but just the psychological aspect of throwing, just having it in your mind, this could be the flight where I throw. Because they could all be that flight, and just having your head around it. Anyway, so you went in with that. You kind of went in with that psychology.
Yeah, but I think
great.
too. I mean, all due respect to Revis, who's a superstar. Like you can become obsessed with that kind of thinking, and it actually takes away from the quality of your flying. Like if you start to work through those permutations, and Revis has that kind of brain where he's always processing that stuff. I think that would be distracting to me. So for me, it starts on launch. It's like, today might be the day. What are you going to do? Like just going through what you need to remember and where you need to be in your head so that you're not hesitating. I mean, I think it was Pal in one of the podcasts. He said, when you're practicing new moves in acro, like every flight is a reserve toss. That's the mindset you have to have. And I remember thinking that later, like, yeah, man, that is the mindset you should have every flight, is just, this might be the time. Am I ready for that? Like just mentally go through the motions, because It's easy. You know, I fly Crestline a lot, and I love that place, but it's pretty full on up there, and you've got the hangies, you know, gearing up, and it's windy up there. And so you kind of get in your head, and you're like, yeah, I got this. And you do the sort of 5-step pre-flight check and all that stuff, and you're going through the motions, but are you really stopping and thinking about that stuff? Or are you just kind of like tapping your helmet, tapping your buckles? I'm good to go. So what I do now is actually gear up before I step out onto launch, and I just go through the mental process. But yeah, it's all, you know, these are all lessons that I've learned now. But at the time, it was like, yeah, man, I'm good to go. This is all going to be great. So, so seeing that crash right off of launch, again, it just made me kind of hyper aware, like, oh, yeah, this is real. You know, like, you better be ready if it comes today. And so that day was like the perfect day. I mean, we were just flying, and I got farther out. I got way out past like DeViz, and another pilot and I were kind of tag teaming it. So one of us would get high and push ahead, and then the other guy would follow, and then he would get high and then push ahead. And so we were just kind of working our way back. And he was out there by Three Kings out in front. And for those that don't know Valle, it's basically like there's a convergence line that runs sort of west to east, and you just try and stay on that line. But sometimes it gets a little sinky, and so you're searching for rising air. So he was out by the Three Kings area, and I was just kind of killing time over Magway. And I'd spent, I'm not joking, probably 2.5 hours flying that spot 3 days earlier, just scratching. It was lifty. It gets rowdy there, but there's rising air, and that's a good trigger. That's a good place to climb out, or so I thought. And on that day, I had gotten back there into the Magway Mesa again, and it was just a little punchy, and I was just kind of killing time, and I got up a little bit, and I was on bar, and I was pushing out towards where Brian was, trying to kind of catch up to him. And I just was flying along. Everything seemed pretty good, and then it wasn't. You know, I took a pretty big collapse. I was probably, you know, I've gone back and put it up on Duorama, and it's quite eye-opening to see your flight with thermal circles and everything, and then suddenly a vertical drop straight down in the Duorama track. But so I was probably 800 feet above ground, but the trees there are 100 plus feet tall. So for me, it all happened pretty fast. So the wing kind of like collapsed, and then I tried to control it, and then it went behind me, and then it shot forward. And when I swung under it, I put a twist in the risers, and then when it came back around, I was trying to untwist, and none of it was feeling very good. And the whole time I'm just dropping. And so Theo in the back of my head is like, "Where's your altitude?" And I looked, and I was like, "Not good, dude, not good at all." And I reached for the handle, I grabbed it, I pulled it out, and I chucked it out, and I was waiting for that solid tug that I'd heard about, and it didn't come, and I just reached behind my head, and I found the bridle, and I gave like a full whack on it, and then I balled up and was in the tree. So I never even saw the reserve open. I never felt it open, but I know that it opened because when I was in the tree later, it was totally open and laid out over the top of the tree. So that was pretty hairball. But I remember, and you'll find this funny or not, but I remember like the moment I was like, yep, I'm throwing my reserve, being stoked, being like, yeah, buddy, I'm throwing a reserve. Like, this is real, and I know what to do. Like, it was hilarious, you know, like, okay, great. And so, there was this moment where I settle in the tree, the pine needles are raining down, you know, everything is just kind of like, whoa, what just happened? And then it's like, okay, I'm okay. You do the body assessment. You make sure everything's all right. And it was pretty full on. So for me, you know, you would think that throwing the reserve would be kind of the riskiest, scariest part of the day. But actually, when I started to assess my situation, I was a good 20 plus, maybe 25 meters above the ground in a tree, and I was hanging out at the edge of the tree, so I wasn't close to the tree trunk. And I remember reaching and grabbing a branch and pulling on it to try and pull myself closer to the trunk, and having the branch snap off in my hand. And it wasn't a twig. It was like pretty solid branch, and thinking, okay, that's not good. And so again, like, I'm trained to just chill in bad situations. Like, people who work with me in pretty hairball situations know that when it gets really gnarly, I get really quiet. Like I start to just breathe, and it's like that's one of my calling cards. And so I was just like, all right, just chill, man. What's going on here? So the first thing I said is I need to communicate. I need to let people know that I've landed in the tree and I'm okay. So I grabbed my radio and I said, came down Magway Mesa. I've landed in the tree. I'm okay. Working my way down the tree now. And then I had the InReach, the Garmin InReach, and I punched in a note and said, hey guys, here's the deal. I've landed in a tree. I'm okay. Great. Figured that I've now communicated my situation and it's all good. And then I have a whistle and I blow on the whistle and I hear these farmers coming up the hill. So that's a good sign. And I'm just trying to kind of get it all together. So the farmers arrive and, they're shouting at me from way down below. And they're like, you need to come down. You need to come down. And fortunately, I speak enough Spanish to kind of communicate with them. And I said, well, I want to come down. Trust me. But I need to just take a moment to kind of gather myself together. And they're like, no, you need to hurry. You need to come down now. Do you have a rope? And I said, I don't have a rope. And they said, well, we have a rope. And you can just see the whole thing is ratcheting up. Like they're kind of freaking out. And I'm just in the back of my head, I'm like, get me the hell out of this place. I want to just get my feet on the ground. But man, dental floss. Like I was so happy to have dental floss. And it's one of those stupid things, you hear about these little things like, yeah, you should always carry dental floss. And I'm a big guy and I'm sort of heavy on the wing. So I'm always looking for a few ounces here and there. And I've done stupid things like left my little micro leather man behind and stuff like that. But dental floss is one of those things in Valle. You should have 2 packs of dental floss. Anyway, so I send the dental floss down and the dudes send up the bitter end of the rope and I get it up to me and I can't detach my pod, so I have to get out of the pod, and I just put my foot on another branch, which snaps off, and so that's not good. And then the guys shout up to me like, this tree is dead, you need to get out of the tree. So all this is just adding up to be like, oh, the reserve toss maybe wasn't the worst part of today. But so they send up the rope, and I'm looking at it, and it's a pretty significant length of rope, and I can see they've knotted it in the middle. It's actually 2 ropes. And so as I'm trying to tie in, I suddenly think, well, I should probably check that knot, right? Because my life is depending on it. And so I pull it up, and it is the sketchiest square knot ever. I don't even think it qualified as a square knot. Like it definitely could have just slipped with me coming down. And so I tied a proper knot, and then I did a little swami belt, and I wrapped the thing around the tree. And then, at this point now, I'm making jokes with these guys like, hey, should we negotiate the price now or when I get on the ground? And they're laughing. And they're like, I said, it's going to take 2 or 3 of you guys to hold me. And they're like, what? How much do you weigh? And I'm like, yeah, I'm probably the weight of 2 of you guys. And they're like, no way. And at the same time, they're saying like, just wrap the rope under your arms. Like you don't need to take time to do a swami. And I was like, no, man, you wrap the rope under your arms, you can suffocate. Like your diaphragm you can't breathe. I learned this before. So again, I think one of the key lessons was just taking your time and being chilled. Like you are the pilot in control. You need to take charge and you need to make sure that everybody understands what's going on. Finally, I get the rope sorted out and the guys are on belay and I'm coming down the tree and, the whole time they're like making jokes like, I think he weighs 100 kilos. And another guy's like, I'll bet you 50 pesos. This guy weighs 110 kilos. And they're like slowing me down so they can take bets on the way down. And I'm just like, this is great, awesome. But I get on the ground and I'm super stoked, first of all, and I'm shaking hands and I'm saying thanks to everybody. And I'm looking at my InReach and I see it's still cycling the message. And at that point I'm thinking, oh man, maybe that message didn't go out. So that's kind of a drag. But again, it's not that I was in a state of shock, but probably I was to some degree. But at the same time, it's like I was very focused on the situation at hand and wasn't really worried about what was, outside my arm's reach. So, but anyway, yeah. So, I say to the guys like, okay, I've got to get my gear down. And they go, yeah, we've got a plan for that. And I said, great, what's the plan? And this like 14-year-old comes walking out of the forest with a chainsaw. I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, that tree is dead, man. Like no one's going up that tree to get your gear. You're lucky you made it down alive. And I was like, what? Wait a minute. You're going to cut the tree down with my wing and my reserve and my harness and everything, 80 feet off the ground? And they're like, yeah, that's the only way you're going to get it back. So I backed out of the way and they revved this thing up and charged it. And they were really good. I mean, they're like farmers in a forested area, so they know how to cut down trees. And they dropped it right in this clearing. And when I collected the wing, it had a little tear, like maybe a half-meter tear down one panel. And it was really the reserve that just got perforated because the fabric is so light, and it took about 20 hits. So, but the pod was fine. Everything else was fine. And so collected it up and went down into town, bought them a bunch of beer, paid them a pretty fair price, I think, what I would pay to get my stuff out of a tree in the States. And yeah, it was the perfect day. I mean, it was literally like sitting here telling you about it. It could not have gone better. Could it have gone worse? Hell yeah. But for me, I feel
totally.
like,
I mean, yet another, you then you had to sit there agonizingly for the next 5 days waiting for your wing to get fixed and had to pretty much watch the Monarca go by. But we had, at least a couple reserve tosses every day of the comp. And then I know there were many more before, and I'm sure after, Valle does that, especially when you're racing with a whole bunch of people. But I don't think there was a single injury.
No.
With all the reserves I heard about, there was, John Hunt, our good friend down in Wyoming, threw his the last day and
landed on like a boulder
there
pile.
might have been some ankles and stuff. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He landed in a nasty spot and he was totally fine. So we'll stop there for a second and go, reserves are great. Use them, get them out. But what, since your feet hit the ground, you've had all this time to kind of digest. Before we move on to some of the other takeaways, you wrote in your email that there was quite a bit there. Like, okay, I was psyched I threw my reserve, but should I have gotten in that? Could I have avoided that situation altogether? And then you mentioned something about the inReach, but now with 2020 hindsight, what would you have done differently about just everything?
Yeah.
So thus far.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is I was in a place that was not a happy place. And I was just sort of scratching around because I thought that's what great pilots do. Like great pilots just power through the bad stuff and they scratch and they make it work. And I've come to realize now, telling this story to other people and some great pilots that I've talked to, that great pilots actually don't do that. They get some altitude. They get clear. They don't hang out in shitty places because shitty places are where bad things happen. But when you're a fairly new pilot and you're trying to emulate, the great ones and you watch way too many YouTube videos and things like that, you think that that's normal. So where I fly, which is mostly Marshall, Crestline, Santa Barbara stuff, conditions are such that they're pretty tame most of the year, or what the situation is. And we get, within 100 feet of the ground in the terrain on a regular basis, but in areas that we're very familiar with, that we're very used to, in conditions that we're very comfortable with. To go to a new place and fly like that and be, in a situation where I wasn't comfortable, but I was just kind of living there waiting, now I would have gotten out of there. Even if it meant landing out somewhere, like that would have been way preferable. So I think that that's a good lesson to learn, is that scratching and being close to the terrain is never a good idea if you have an option, and especially a bad idea if you're in a place that you don't know, you don't have wired. And you probably never have any place wired. I mean, do you have Sun Valley completely wired?
No.
Some days, maybe,
no no way.
Yeah, exactly. Like there are days where it can still bite you, right?
Yeah, and I think scratching is a term that's pretty nebulous. We hear it all the time, and I think it's wise to point out, like you have, that that there's a million different versions of that. And in the flats, that could be a low save can literally be 10 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
But if it's in the middle of the day when things are ripping off really strong, a lot of pilots have gotten in really serious trouble scratching off the ground when it's a dust devil or something.
Yeah.
I mean, if that thing's wound tight, there's almost no skill that can handle something like that. Like scratching in Magay, like where you were, the problem there is it's pretty shallow terrain. So you don't really have, if it doesn't work, you don't have a great place to run to. And so scratching there is at the top of the ridge. Scratching there is
exactly.
not down on top of the trees, down in the flats. That's, you don't have a bailout then.
Yeah.
So, scratching requires, there are extremes to this. Like when Will and I crossed the Rockies, we were constantly flying over terrain where there was no place to land, but you're going to places that have a really, really high odds of being able to get out, because you've got those skills and that that's a trigger and that should work. And, so that can be scratching too, but you've still got 2,000 feet of air below you.
Exactly.
So
So
that's just experience.
The other thing that I mentioned was the inReach. So a couple of things about radio and satellite communications that have become very clear to me now. The first one is with the inReach. It's an amazing device. I mean, we had a situation where we were flying Pine last summer, and we had a couple of pilots go down in the Sespe Wilderness. And, they weren't far from the road, maybe 4 or 5 miles, but it was full-on bushwhack, and it took 10 hours for each of those guys to come out. And because we had the inReach, it was basically just a wait and watch situation. And when they came out, I had beer and fried chicken, and it was all smiles. It was all good. But if we didn't have that stuff and those guys had landed in the wilderness, I don't know, how long do you wait before you call search and rescue? And anytime you're calling search and rescue, that's not a good place to be for anybody. Search and rescue guys, the people on the ground, it's just bad. So I'm a big fan of the inReach device. I think it's probably one of the reasons that we're able to fly the lines and the way that we do. But here's what I learned is that the inReach isn't very good when the satellite coverage is obscured by trees. So when you're 100 feet down in the forest and you're not getting good, solid satellite coverage, that message that you thought you'd sent to everybody saying, I'm okay, didn't actually go out. And I feel bad because...
So you got one out... You got one out that
later.
was, I've landed in a tree, but no one got out. No one got the one that I'm okay.
No, they didn't even get the one that I landed in the tree. They got nothing because it was cycling as I was coming down. And so...
Gotcha. So you should have hung out there longer.
Exactly. I should have hung out and waited for a response. So communication has to be two-way communication. We hear about it. But if you're sending a message and nobody's sending a message back, it's a message in a bottle, and that's not a good place to be. So if I was doing it again, and let's hope I'm not, but if I do, I will certainly wait there a few extra minutes and make sure that somebody pings me back and says, got it, let us know when you're safe on the ground or something like that. The other thing, which I learned later, is that my 2-meter radio was suffering a lot from proximity to my GPS and Vario device, that when I'm 20 feet away from somebody on launch going, radio check, and they're going, yeah, good check, that's one thing. When you're a mile away from them and your Vario and your flight instruments and all that stuff are interfering, they're not hearing you and you're not hearing them very clearly, that's a problem. And at the time, again, it comes back to mindset. We'll touch on that in a second. But at the time, I was thinking, oh, this is all good. I've got the ability to communicate if I need to. But I didn't really put it to the test until that day in the tree. And it turned out that test I failed. I radioed out, I'm okay, but nobody heard that. So my wing is yellow, my reserve is yellow. All they saw was a bunch of yellow in a tree. They didn't know that I'd thrown the reserve and that I was okay. So what happened on the ground? A bunch of people went into search and rescue mode and were gearing up to come up and find me and all that stuff. And my friends were nervous and sweating it. And all those things are just things you don't want to have happen. So I was able to communicate an hour later when I was safely on the ground and in the clear, but that's an hour of pain and suffering that I'd rather not put people through. So a lesson learned is to always communicate and get a communication back in response, and then you'll know. And as far as the 2-meter radios go, find some way to block probably with your body, which is not the healthiest thing because now you've just got radio waves bearing through you, but find a way to just make sure that the radio is working better. I did do a flight the other day at Marshall with Christo and some of those guys, and I put the radio in the back of the harness, and I brought the mic around, and then so my body was blocking it from the UDI 4, and it was great. It was fine. So I think it's a simple fix now, but at the time, I wish I'd known that back then.
So far we've got radio and communication. So radio, inReach, keeping things super slow. Comedy sounds like that was very, very important. Proper tree kit, which for you was dental floss, probably some other stuff we could talk about that would have been good to have. Lack of SIV. You mentioned earlier. I think we're going to get to that later on.
Yeah, we'll come back
poor
to
choice of where you're scratching. So we've got. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? When you break down an accident, it's never one thing. There's always a bunch of little things that lead up, and these are actually all you just threw your reserve, and these are all things that you learned afterwards. But it's they all contribute.
I got to work on an Everest film, an IMAX film with Ed Viesters, and he talked about the cascade of errors. He said people die on Everest because they lose a mitten. It's like, no, how does that work? Yeah. And he runs through, like you lose a mitten and then your hand freezes and then you can't do this and you can't untie the rope. And he just went through this chain of events, the cascade of errors, and you're like, holy shit, like that's the real deal. And it's the same thing here. It goes back to that mindset. It's very easy when you've flown a location a couple hundred times and you're super comfortable, complacency kills. And so you want to start every flight, not freaking out, not paranoid, but just being smart. Like, what's my mindset today? These are the things that might happen. Am I ready for these things? What are the steps that I'm going to take if something goes wrong? Cool, I'm good to go. And then you fly and you have a great flight. But if you're taking it a little too casually, if you're sort of blowing through some of your checks and things like that because you've done it so many times, like those stupid little things add up to, hey man, I just pulled my reserve and I'm about to land in a tree in some country that I don't live. Yeah, it can get scary.
Okay, cool. Well, keep going. I know you're going to talk about SIV.
Let's talk about SIV, because I think my biggest mistake was not having flown an SIV. And it wasn't that I'm overly confident. Like, I fly because, for a couple of reasons. I fly places that are probably a little bit more aggressive. In many cases, because I'm flying with other pilots that I really respect and admire, who I know are kind of keeping an eye on me. Like, I've flown in the Owens on days where Mitch Riley will say, "What do you think, Myles?" And I'll say, "I'm not sure about today." And I go, "That's a good call." Like, he's watching out for me and stuff like that. But at the same time, I also want to emulate and be around better pilots because it makes me a better pilot. And so, I'm used to that. But SIV is something that I've been hearing about for a long time. I've tried to do it. I had an SIV scheduled last fall, and then we had all these brush fires in California, and it got pushed off. And so I'm actually going to go do it in about 10 days' time. And I'm super excited because I think that everything that I experienced in that moment when the wing collapsed could have been resolved based on SIV experience. But because I hadn't done that, I over-controlled the wing. I didn't let the wing do what it was supposed to do. And it was amazing. I mean, you'll know this because you've been through this before, but it was amazing how it went from all good to all bad so fast. And the energy is just building and the thing is just cascading. It's like, oh, I just have a little collapse. Well, now I have a collapse and a twist. Now I have a collapse and a twist. And it's just like all happening in front of you. And you're very reactive. Like, there's no sort of getting out in front of the action.
Without seeing it. I mean, there's a couple encouraging things here. One is you seem to remember very well what happened, which means that your brain, often when people have a big cascade, they literally cannot explain it. They'll remember like the initial blowout, and then it's all just a blur because their brain is way behind what's happening. There's way too much adrenaline. There's not nearly enough training, and they just haven't dealt with that before, and they're just massively overloaded. So you remember, I think it sounds like quite clearly,
pretty well. Yeah.
What I can say without having seen it at all, 99.9% I can say, that you did way too much. Almost guaranteed.
Sure.
When you start flying comp wings and you're at the other end of the thing, then it's things change a lot. You have to be super reactive and catch stuff.
Or proactive,
otherwise,
like be ahead of the curve.
Proactive, exactly. Sorry, not reactive, proactive. But in your case, it was probably massive blowout and then just overcorrecting it until you threw your reserve.
Totally.
Most likely, it may not have been, but
I've heard stories where guys are like, and there I was, and my wing was out below my feet, and I was above it, and I was just like, oh, when does that really happen? Well, that really happens, man. It happens fast, So it was definitely it was a good experience, and I'm glad to be laughing about it for sure now. But I remember at one point I just think hands up, man. And so it's all balled up, and I'm thinking I've got this. And I put my hands up and nothing happens. And then the thing just shoots out in front of me and it's already spinning. It's already twisting as it goes past me. And it's like, what? Yeah. So it was definitely all happening. But I've heard stories of people riding it into the ground, like trying to correct it. And then they just end up on the ground.
Time.
And I keep thinking, like, how do you do that? How do you not just check out and go, it's time to throw the reserve? And now I know, because you're so caught up in it. And you think, I've got this, man. I'm a second away from having this thing flying. And all of a sudden, you're done. You're like out of room. So for me, again, just that knowing that there's a point where no matter what's happening, it's game over. You need to chuck that reserve or it's going to only get worse. And like I said, that moment came and I was just like, yeah, man, I'm throwing my reserve. Like I was super excited, super stoked. Like I've just made the decision. It's all happening now, And then, yeah, I probably should have made that decision 5 seconds earlier, 10 seconds earlier. But yeah, it was the right call.
I think that, the SIV is one of these complicated things, and a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about it. To me, and we've talked about this a lot on the show, so we don't need to hammer on it here. But the warning I always have for people is, well, one, they're just super essential. If you're going to fly XC, you got to do SAVs. But the first one is just the first one. It really needs to be like part of a training regimen because. And I come back to Revis's comment on it. What you get from doing a lot of them and what you get a lot more from actually, like when you start doing a lot of acro training, is being able to recognize how bad this is in that instant and going, okay, I mean, pretty much every configuration can be fixed other than a massive cravat or something. And even those, if you have enough altitude, can be fixed most of the time.
Yeah.
But what you start getting good at is that you've had so many blowouts from doing so much SIV and so much acro that you can go, okay, this is going to take me 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
I'm 800 feet off the ground. There's no point in trying to fix this. I'm going to throw right now, especially if you've got a steerable or something. You might be able to get to a nice place, But exactly like you said, I mean, if you're in a configuration like a massive auto rotation or something, if you're in something where your wing might start throwing you into a loop, you might go into the wing. It might potentially get a lot worse.
Yeah.
And so there's no reason to wait. So a lot of it's just being able to identify, okay, I've got 4 riser twists. Well, I know 4 riser twists are going to take at least 600, 800 feet to get out. It takes a while to spin out of something like that. So, that's the next lesson for you, SIV.
The farmers up there, when they got me on the ground, they were laughing. They're like, "Hey man, next time if you could just land like 200 meters over there in the field, it's just a lot easier for everybody." And I was like, "Yeah, thanks for that. I'll try to remember that." It was pretty hilarious. So that's SIV. The other thing is reserves work. We talked about it at the front of this, but from the first day of training, people are like, throw the reserve. And stories, and I know stories of people that have thrown reserves 100 feet off the deck. I mean, like crazy that shouldn't work, and yet it does something. It just helps. And
there is no too
there's
low.
never a bad time to throw a reserve. And I think, again, Valle is real. People are throwing reserves down there every day. And I don't mean to make Valle like a scary place, because I actually think
that's a numbers game. There's just so many people. People are flying in winter. They're rusty,
And we ran the numbers. Yeah. I think I did the math, but it was like, if you imagine 150 pilots every day for 14 days, 2,100 flights. I forget what the number is, but probably, I don't know, 25 reserve tosses. Like the percentages are not that crazy. You compare that to some of the things that people are doing on snowboards or mountain bikes and stuff like that, where the numbers of injuries go much, much higher than that. So that was a question I had for you, Gavin, is like, we talk about risk and you get these questions like, man, isn't paragliding a risky sport? Like, how do you, it's not that you have to defend it, but how do you explain or describe your willingness, the risk versus reward ratio? Because I have something that I've just hit on, but I want to hear how you describe it.
Yeah, I have gone kind of all over the map with that one. And certainly my relationship with risk since having a little girl 7 months ago, I definitely can't see that I'm slowing down. But, when I was in the X-Alps last summer, I was definitely thinking about it. I had her on my flight deck with me.
Yeah, nice.
And I mean, like I said, I have always said that, training can remove most, if not all, of the risk, the real risk. And, I still take way more risk. I know this, getting in my car every day to go to the grocery store than flying a paraglider.
Yeah.
So I firmly believe, and I know for a fact that, that we can have fun and participate in this sport without taking too much risk.
Yeah.
Now, if you fly enough time and you fly across country, you are going to get into situations, and that's inevitable.
Yeah.
And I certainly have put myself in, especially as I was, maybe going through more of that intermediate phase of my flying career, where I was putting myself in too many of those. And I know a lot of people around me were pretty worried about me. And
we know other pilots that are doing that now, that we see. And it's kind of like, I'll tell you that story in a second, but yeah.
I mean, for me, the risks are acceptable because I see a lot of my mentors and a lot of pilots that have been at it for a lot longer than I have, and they have no injuries.
Yeah.
So for sure, it can be done safely, and you just have to, I think Chris Santacroce's advice, that's, you pick the day, you fly the good days, you don't fly the bad days.
And will as well. What was it? The positive power, negative thinking, or whatever it was.
Exactly.
And just slow, steady progression. I mean, those are the lessons that I'm learning.
I think all these things add up. For me, it's, my life would be marginalized in a huge way if I didn't fly. It's that important to me that, I wouldn't be the same dad. I wouldn't be the same partner. I wouldn't be as exciting and as fun to be around if I didn't fly.
Yeah.
So I'd be robbing the people that are around me of me.
Yeah. I mean, I see the same thing. I'm a better person on so many levels because of paragliding. It's made me healthier. Yeah. It's made me happier. It's made me saner. It's given me all kinds of motivation, like all kinds of reasons why it's good. And yet, especially to the mere mortals that ask that question, like, well, isn't it a risky sport? How do you justify that risk? I used to try and compare it to things. Oh, it's no more dangerous than, snowboarding off-piste or here in Southern California, we have, I don't know if you're familiar with ghost bikes, but I ride my bike on Pacific Coast Highway, and like a 25-mile loop, I come across 5 of these ghost bikes that are memorials to car cyclist fatalities. And, you do an hour-long ride and you go past 5 of those things, and it certainly wakes you up. But what I've come to realize is that you're never going to be able to defend it. So what you need to do is tell people why. Why is it important to you? Why is the risk versus the reward? And on the flight back from London last week, I watched this Bruce McLaren documentary, and at the end in the film, he says this thing, and I'm just going to read it to you because it's just so perfect. But he says, "It would be a waste of life to do nothing with one's ability, for I feel that life is measured in achievement, not in years alone." And I think about that, and I'm like, you know what? That's exactly it. Like when people say, like, what's the thing that turns you on? It's experience. It's getting out and trying new things and trying different things. And for me, it's about achievements in life and less about just, I was 80 years old, but I didn't really do much. So I'm willing to take those risks because the rewards are so high for me. And not everybody is like me. And if they're not, more power to them. Like recognizing where your limitations are, I think, is a big positive step. So, but anyway, I was curious to see what you thought about that, because it raises this question like, okay, so I go to Mexico, I have this reserve toss, I end up in a tree, I drink beer that night, and it's all good. No injuries. I mean, the worst thing that happens is some damage to my wing. And now I get home and my wife says to me, "How was your trip?" What do I say? It was awesome. I tossed my reserve and I landed in a tree and the farmers had to come and rescue me and blah, 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 blah. Her eyes are just going to bug out of her head and she's going to be scared. And that's not what I want. I want her to be happy. My paragliding is important to me and I don't want to freak her out about it. And so I'm sort of challenged by, like, how do you deal with something like that? And I've tried to come up with comparable situations, and it's just not. There is no comparable situation. So what do you think? Like, what would your advice be?
Again, when I landed in the trees in the X Alps, I stuffed it into this terrible canyon. It was howling wind and just no way to get out. And so I landed in this tree and I got immediately back on the road. I was able to just yank it out of the tree. It was like the most perfect landing, not because of skill. I just got kind of lucky and got on the road and started marching down the road. And there were two reactions that just solidified, I don't know, just coolness to me. One was I sent a text to Maddie and I said, I just landed in the tree. And her reply was, that's awesome. And she put a bunch of those funny, like, the emoticons where you're laughing hysterically.
With tears coming out of your eyes, right?
Yeah. And then when I pulled into this cul-de-sac and Bruce and Ben were there in the RV, and there's some adrenaline pumping, and I'm kind of hopped up, and it was a monster. I think I did 17,000 feet of vertical that day. It was a huge day,
crazy.
And so I'd had all that vertical, and I was still charging, and I just landed in the trees. I was like the third flight of the day, and so I'm kind of excited to talk about it a little bit. Just 30 seconds, like, hey, you got to land in the tree. And Bruce just looked at me and it was like, we don't have any time for that right now. Get going, And I went back on the road and I thought, I'm surrounded by the coolest people.
Right.
This is awesome. Nobody gives a shit.
Right.
And that is not the answer to your question.
But
I think that
it's helpful.
I think that, if people see that you're training, if you're doing the work and you're being smart, then, people should want you to have those experiences, because if you're not, then again, you're marginalizing your experience, which is going to marginalize your experience with them.
Yeah.
And so, thankfully I've got a partner who's just like, if you don't pursue what you want to pursue, that could be a huge opportunity. And how can I rob you of an opportunity?
So is it cool if I get Maddie to call Jeanette and just tell her?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think that, the flip side is what happened to you is kind of inevitable.
Yeah.
We are playing in the air, and even if you do everything right, and even if you do all the training, and even if you have all the skills, the numbers still don't really look very good for us. If you fly a long, long time, something's going to happen. And so hopefully, it goes down like you did, and that's, you take a coin out of the luck jar, and that's all you need to do,
And I feel like that was a super positive experience. Like, a lot of people said, oh man, you must have been so bummed. No way. I'm so stoked that it all went down, and went down the way that it did, because I've learned so much. I was really happy when you said to me, I sent you that email and you're like, man, if you're assessing this accident the way that you are, like, you're going to be a great pilot, because you're really being sort of like critical about what happened and where you went wrong and how not to do that again. And that was just exactly what I wanted to hear, what I needed to hear, because that's the goal ultimately, is to be a better pilot. And when you're down there and you're flying with guys like you and Kansas and Mitch and all these guys, those guys, you guys are having your own moments, but you have the experience, you have all those years of flying under your belt, so that you get through that and it's just a blip. Where in my case, it wasn't a blip. It was basically a big U-turn. And so now I know. So I've learned some lessons, but yeah, interesting.
Tell me about, and be honest with it, but tell me about, when you think about flying now and potentially having to throw your reserve, does it give you the jitters, or is it like, oh, I've done that before, no, I'm going to be more comfortable with that? Does it make you less or more comfortable?
Well, it's interesting. So when it all went down, as you said, I went to Miguel and Enrique at the Alas del Hombre shop and said, do you guys have somebody that can fix the wing? Because I really want to get back in the air. And they're like, yeah, we've got somebody and it'll be ready in a couple of days or whatever. And so I was chomping, man. I was ready to go. And then a couple of days went by and it wasn't ready. And then it was 4 days and then it was 5 days. And at the end, it wasn't ready at all. And I literally, like they had said, just come to launch. It'll be on launch ready. And I went up with all my gear and I was pumped up and ready to go. And it wasn't ready. So I didn't get to fly. And then I came home with it and I went to, I took it to Mitch McAleer up in Crestline. And big shout out to Mitch McAleer, who is like an amazing, what would you call him, a seamster, tailor? Anyway, that guy just, he killed it, man.
Yeah,
he did such a good job.
Jedi.
Yeah. But, that took about 10 days. And in that 10 days, little voices started talking in the back of my head. And so I was kind of like, I went from being like, all I ever do, think about, breathe, eat, sleep, read is paragliding to, yeah, I'm going to get back to it. But, and I think part of it was just still coming to grips with what had happened and assessing poor judgment, bad choices that I had made to the point where I finally said, okay, now I've got it sorted. Like I know where I went wrong and I'm not going to make those mistakes again. But up until that point, I was a little nervous. Like, what if I go and I do the same stupid things? What if I go out there and I'm not conscious of a mistake that I made and I make that same mistake again? But since I've got the wing back, I've done, 8 flights from Marshall, a few hours here and there, and been loving it. The weather hasn't been great down here, so it's kind of catch can. But digging it. And have been in some punchy air. Was up in the convergence above Crestline the other day at just over 6,000 feet and was getting jacked around. I was just like, yeah, baby, bring it. Was super happy about that. So I feel like any fear or any concern, I've put it behind me, but I'm much more conscious and aware than I was before. And that's a good thing. One of the things that I wanted to shout out about, other people have talked about this before, and it is definitely a philosophy that I've tried to live by, not just fly by, but live by. But it's this 8/10 philosophy. You and I talked about it a little bit in Sun Valley, but essentially it's you push your limits to 8/10 because inevitably there's something out there that you're not ready for that's going to come and get you to 10/10 and sometimes in a hurry. And 10/10 is a real place to be, man. That's life or death. And if you're living at 10/10 and something comes along, you may find that you're not up to it. And what I realize is that even at what I consider to be 8/10, I don't really know where 10 is. I'm still new enough to this game that 10 could be right around the corner. It could be a million miles away. I'm still figuring it out. And so what I'm trying to do is not be cowardly or fly in fear, but to be real about the situation and to stay within safe limits and safe boundaries so that when it does go bad, when I do take a collapse or something like that, I have the room and I have the time and I have the ability to get out of it. And that's, I think that, and we all know pilots that are way out there, they're at 11/10 far too often. And luck is not a survival strategy. Thinking, I'm just going to get lucky and make this work. That's a bad place to be. So,
on that note, tell me about the kid you met at the awards ceremony that had like 20 flights or something. That's a good place to take it.
Oh, man.
I just like that whole not knowing. That's the problem with this sport is not swimming. What you don't know, you don't know. And exactly. That's kind of spooky.
It's like if you meet somebody on the beach who says, I'm learning to surf, and it's a double overhead day, and the guy looks like he can swim and handle it, go for it, man, see how you do. But in paragliding, it's super real, super fast. And if you don't have at least the basic skills and familiarity, it's bad. So anyway, at the award ceremony at the night at the Monarca, I was sort of milling about in the crowd waiting for my wing to show up. I literally got my wing the night of the award ceremony and was on a plane the next morning. But and this kid was there and he's like, hey, man, have you been flying Valle? And I go, yeah, it's awesome here. And he's like, oh, that's great. I'm a new pilot, P2 at 20 hours, and I just came down here to see what the scene is like, and I'm looking to gain some experience. And I said, well, Valle is real. There's reserve tosses almost every day, and you need to be sort of ramping up. You want to launch in the mornings, you want to launch in the afternoons, but you don't want to fly the heat of the day. And he goes, I don't even know if I would be able to toss my reserve. I don't even know what to do. And I just looked at him and I said, dude, you need to go and talk to the local guys and get somebody to just basically guide you. You do not want to be flying this place solo. You don't want to be launching without other people. Just saying that out loud scared the crap out of me. And then later on, I was thinking,
you just had no idea.
Yeah, what do you do? Should I have smacked him down? Dude, just go drink beer and don't get in the air. That's not good. That's one of the great things about this sport is it's up to you. You're the pilot in charge. You make the choices. But the problem is, and especially in a place like Valle, because, like any of these flying sites that are super popular, they're also under constant scrutiny. And what you don't want are accidents and fatalities that draw negative attention to the spot, because it just makes it harder for Miguel. It makes it harder for the comps and everything else. So again, it's a question for the community, but like, at what level do we need to step in and say, hang on a second, man, you're taking a risk that's not just a risk for you to determine, but a risk that's going to affect all of us, and maybe, find a way to at least talk them down. Because this guy clearly had no idea what he was getting into.
He just didn't know. I mean, he
20 hours.
He was behaving very poorly, but he didn't know he was. It wasn't his fault.
Yeah. No, he was super pumped. He's like, I'm in Valle. This place looks awesome. Look at all these great pilots. Yeah. And I was just like, dude, this place is real, and you need to be very, very careful and recognize your limitations.
Be vigilant.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a good place to bring it. In the latest USPA mag that just came out, there's a big article that we did about the X-Alps with Ben and Bruce's perspective and my own, but the editor's note in the front by Nick Grease, he talked about he was flying in a foreign place. He and I were down in Brazil this fall. I don't know if it was there or it was his experience in Kenya, which I think was pretty tough from what it sounded like. But he does a really good editorial about what our jobs, pilots that have more experience, if they see somebody on launch, that just clearly doesn't have it. Is it our role to step in, or is it our role to let them feel it out? And, he was real clear, and I totally agree with him that, we need to be friendly about it and be tactful and be kind, but yeah, man, that's somebody's life. You definitely have to step in like you did, because they might not know.
They just don't know.
If you see somebody just totally blowing a launch and it's 11 a.m. in Valle, and you're like, hey man, do you know what you're getting into here?
Well, and without sounding selfish, but there's nothing worse than going out for a good flying day or a good climbing day or a good skiing day and suddenly getting sucked into a search and rescue situation.
Yeah,
that's just super stressful. Your day is shot. Like, the stakes are high. I mean, it puts responsibility and stress on everybody. And if a couple of words on launch might avert that or something like that, by all means, I think that's a smart thing to do. And you see that in Europe. I mean, it was amazing when I flew in Gordon the first time. Like, people are talking all the time about, oh, your wing's doing this, or hey man, you want to check? And those guys are super dialed. Like, I remember just watching 5 guys launch at Gordon, and every single launch was just super relaxed and calm and like waiting. Perfect. Okay, yeah, and perfect. And I just remember thinking, oh, I got to step up my game. Like, this place, these guys, they're doing it right. Yeah, it was super cool.
That is cool. Well, yeah, a shout out to all the listeners then too. We're a community where it's a solo sport, but it only works with everybody together. So I think there's a lot we can do to help people be safe, and this is one of those times. Just hearing about your reserve toss, I think this will make people think about it a lot more clearly, and just think about it. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Myles, thanks for sharing your story, man. I appreciate it.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm so proud to be a part of this podcast, and I'm so thankful that you came up with it to begin with. And people that I talk to, they get excited when they hear who we're talking to. And I think it does change the way that people fly, and hopefully makes people enjoy the sport more, be safer, and have more time, longevity in the sport. So it's good for everybody.
Awesome, man. Thanks, dude. I appreciate it. And,
thank you.
Thanks for all your work on this thing. I couldn't do it without you.
No, it's fun. I'm enjoying it. All right, man. See you up in the sky, I hope.
Right on, dude. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Myles.
Later.
I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. That was cool to kind of break that all down, and it was neat to kind of get into Myles' head and learn more about that event. It's a pretty big event, and it all went really well. So hopefully, we can learn from that and be safer in our own flying. So, as always, all we ask for is $1 a show. If you got something out of this or one of the previous episodes, if you're just discovering the podcast, definitely go back and take a look. There's 60-something episodes now. A lot of great material there. A lot of fantastic characters, great advice, great stories, and it's fun to put them out for you. So, but yeah, $1 a show. You can support us through the website, cloudbasemayhem.com. You can do a one-time support through PayPal. You'll see the links for that. Or you can become a patron of the show, where you only pay when we put content out. You can choose the level. You're only billed when something comes out, and you can be rewarded for doing so. So check that out. That's patreon.com/cloudbasemayhem. And as you can imagine, it takes a lot of time and energy and money to bring you the podcast, and it's all supported by you. We really appreciate it. We're not doing it with sponsors. It's just our listeners. And so another way to support it is just spread the word. Tell your friends. Listen to it on the way up to launch. We're getting into the Northern Hemisphere flying season right now, which I'm pretty stoked about. Imagine you all are as well. So, and also, if you've got people you want to hear on the show, reach out. You'll see that at cloudbasedmayhem.com. You'll see the email link. Just send me a note, and I'll try to get them on the show. We've got many, many more already in the can that'll be coming out to you in the coming weeks. And until then, fly safe, fly far, have fun. Cheers.